The courtroom fell silent as the judge's gavel struck 3 times, each impact echoing through the packed chamber like thunder. I sat perfectly still in my wooden chair, hands folded in my lap, watching my husband's face drain of color as the bailiff approached him with handcuffs gleaming under the fluorescent lights. His expensive lawyer, the one he'd bragged about affording with money he'd hidden from me for decades, was frantically shuffling papers, his confidence evaporating like morning dew under a scorching sun. My husband turned to look at me one final time, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never witnessed in 30 years of marriage. Pure, unfiltered fear. He expected tears, expected me to break down and beg for mercy on his behalf like I'd done so many times before. Instead, I smiled. It was a small smile, barely noticeable to anyone else in that courtroom, but he saw it. He understood in that moment that the woman he'd spent 3 decades tormenting, the woman he'd broken down piece by piece until he thought nothing remained, had been planning this day for longer than he could imagine. The judge cleared her throat and looked directly at me. Her voice was firm but carried an undertone of something else, something that sounded almost like respect. She asked if I had anything to say before she delivered the final rulings. I stood slowly, feeling the weight of 30 years lifting from my shoulders with each inch I rose. Before the story begins, please leave us a comment telling us which state or city you are watching from. Do not forget to like and subscribe so this channel can grow and bring you more exciting stories. That morning had started like every other morning for the past 3 decades. I woke at 5:30, exactly as I'd trained myself to do years ago, before the sun painted the sky with its first brush strokes of pink and gold. The house was silent, except for the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the occasional creak of old wood settling. I slipped out of bed carefully, making sure not to disturb the sheets too much, not to make any sound that might wake him. Even after all these years, my body moved with the practiced caution of someone navigating a minefield. The bedroom was dark, heavy curtains blocking out the pre-dawn light, and I dressed quickly in the bathroom with the door closed, the exhaust fan running to mask any noise. My reflection in the mirror showed a woman of 52 who looked closer to 65. The lines around my eyes weren't laugh lines, they were worry lines, fear lines. Lines carved by 3 decades of walking on eggshells in my own home. My hair, which had once been thick and lustrous black, was now streaked with gray I couldn't afford to cover at a salon. I'd learned to do it myself with box dye from the drugstore, but lately I'd stopped bothering. What was the point? Who was I trying to look good for? Certainly not him. I moved through the morning routine like a ghost haunting my own life. The coffee was measured exactly, 3 scoops, the way he liked it. The newspaper was retrieved from the front porch and placed at his spot at the table, folded just so, business section on top. The eggs were scrambled soft with a touch of cream, the bacon cooked until crispy but not burnt, the toast lightly buttered on both sides. Every detail had to be perfect, because anything less than perfection meant consequences. And after 30 years, I'd learned that perfection was survival. My name is Shanice, and if you'd asked me 35 years ago where I thought my life would be at 52, this wouldn't have been anywhere close to my answer. Back then, I was 20 years old, full of dreams and ambitions, working as a paralegal at a downtown law firm and taking night classes to finish my degree. I was going to be somebody, make something of myself, maybe even become a lawyer. I had friends, aspirations, a family who loved me. I had a future that sparkled with possibility. Then I met Darnell. He was 32, successful, sophisticated, everything a young woman from the neighborhood could want. He drove a nice car, wore expensive suits, worked in finance, and when he smiled at me across the coffee shop where I was studying one evening, I felt like I'd won the lottery. He was attentive, charming, generous with compliments and gifts. He told me I was beautiful, intelligent, destined for greatness. He said he wanted to help me achieve my dreams, support me in every way. He said he loved me. We dated for 6 months, and during that time, he was perfect. He took me to nice restaurants, bought me jewelry I protested was too expensive, met my family, and charmed them completely. My mother loved him. My father, usually suspicious of any man interested in his daughter, actually approved. My friends were jealous. Everyone thought I'd found my prince, my ticket to a better life. The red flags were there, of course. Looking back, I can see them clearly. But at 20 years old, desperate for love and security and validation, I convinced myself they were quirks, signs of how much he cared. The way he called me constantly, needing to know where I was and who I was with. The way he'd show up at my job unexpectedly, claiming he just wanted to take me to lunch, but really checking to see if I was where I said I'd be. The way he discouraged my friendships, particularly with male colleagues, suggesting they had ulterior motives. The way he began criticizing my appearance, my intelligence, my ambitions, always couched in concern, always delivered with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. We got married 3 months after he proposed, a small ceremony because he insisted we should save money for our future. My family was disappointed. They'd wanted to throw me a big wedding, but Darnell convinced me that a quiet ceremony was more romantic, more intimate, more meaningful. What he really wanted was fewer witnesses, fewer people who might notice the changes already beginning to take hold in our relationship. The wedding night was the first time he hit me. We were in a hotel room he'd booked for our wedding night, nothing fancy despite his apparent wealth, and I'd made some comment about the room being smaller than I expected. I was joking, lighthearted, still high on the excitement of the day. He backhanded me so fast I didn't see it coming, his palm connecting with my cheek with a crack that seemed impossibly loud in the small room. I fell onto the bed, more from shock than force, my hand flying to my face as tears sprang to my eyes. He stood over me and his face was completely calm, almost serene. He told me that I needed to learn to appreciate what I had, that complaining was unattractive, that he wouldn't tolerate disrespect in his marriage. Then he left, walking out of the hotel room and not returning until the next morning. I spent my wedding night alone, crying, confused, trying to understand what had just happened. When he returned, he brought flowers and breakfast, acting as if nothing had occurred. He kissed my still tender cheek gently and told me he loved me, that we'd had a misunderstanding, that he hoped we could start fresh. I wanted so badly to believe him that I convinced myself I'd overreacted, that maybe I had been ungrateful, that this was just a bump in the road. The second time happened 2 weeks later, when dinner wasn't ready when he got home from work. The third time was a month after that, when I suggested visiting my parents. By the end of the first year, I'd stopped counting. The physical abuse was terrible, but what broke me down even more effectively was the psychological warfare he waged every single day. He had a gift for finding my vulnerabilities and exploiting them with surgical precision. He knew exactly what to say to make me feel worthless, stupid, ugly, useless. He isolated me systematically, convincing me to quit my job because he made enough money to support us both, encouraging me to skip family gatherings because they were stressful, pointing out how my friends were bad influences who didn't really care about me. Within 2 years, I had no job, no friends, no real connection to my family, and no sense of self-worth beyond what he decided to grant me on any given day. He controlled everything. The money was his, earned by him, managed by him, and he gave me a small allowance each week for groceries and household needs. I had to present receipts for every purchase, explain every cent. If I went over budget, even by $1, there were consequences. If I tried to save any money, hide even a few dollars for emergencies, and he found it. The consequences were worse. He controlled where I went, when I went, how long I stayed. I couldn't visit my mother without permission, couldn't run to the store without checking with him first. He installed cameras in the house under the guise of security, but I knew they were to watch me, to make sure I was doing what I was supposed to do, being who I was supposed to be. He controlled my appearance, criticizing my clothes, my hair, my weight, my everything. If I gained a pound, I was letting myself go. If I lost a pound, I was making myself sick for attention. If I wore makeup, I was trying to attract other men. If I didn't wear makeup, I was embarrassing him by looking haggard. There was no winning, no way to be right, because the point wasn't for me to succeed. The point was for me to fail, so he could maintain control through my constant fear of disappointing him. My family noticed, of course. My mother, who had been so thrilled about the marriage, began asking questions after the first year. Why didn't I visit more? Why did I always have excuses? Why did I look so tired, so thin, so different? I lied to her, smooth lies that came easier with practice. Everything was fine, I was just busy. Darnell worked long hours, and I liked to be home when he got there. We were saving money, so I was being careful with spending. The lies hurt worse than the bruises because I was betraying the people who loved me, cutting the lifelines that might have saved me. My father was more persistent. He showed up at the house one day unannounced, and Darnell wasn't home. I almost collapsed with relief at seeing him, almost broke down and told him everything, but before I could, he looked me in the eye and asked me directly if my husband was hurting me. In that moment, with my father's concerned face in front of me, with a chance at rescue right there for the taking, I lied. I told him everything was wonderful, that he was worrying over nothing, that Darnell was a good husband who took care of me. I watched my father's face crumple with disappointment, not in Darnell, but in me, because he knew I was lying and he knew I was choosing to lie. He told me that his door was always open, that I always had a home with him, but I could see the hurt in his eyes as he left. That was the last real conversation I had with my father. He died 2 years later from a heart attack, and I've carried the guilt of that final lie with him every day since. The years blurred together into a nightmare that felt eternal. There were good days, scattered like oases in a desert. Days when Darnell was charming and attentive like he'd been during our courtship. He'd bring me flowers, take me to dinner, tell me he loved me and couldn't live without me. Those days were almost worse than the bad days because they gave me hope. Made me believe that maybe he was changing, maybe we could make it work, maybe I wasn't trapped after all. But the good days always ended, and the bad days always returned, worse than before. I learned to read his moods like a meteorologist reading weather patterns. I could tell by the way he walked through the door whether it would be a good night or a bad night. I could predict his reactions with uncanny accuracy, knew which topics were safe and which were minefields, understood that my survival depended on my ability to anticipate his needs and meet them before he even had to ask. I became a ghost in my own life, a shadow designed to serve and please and never ever challenge. We never had children, and I thank God for that every single day. Darnell claimed he wanted kids, talked about it sometimes, but he never followed through on making it happen. I think deep down, he knew that children would complicate his control, would introduce variables he couldn't manage. Or maybe he just didn't want to share my attention, didn't want competition for the center of my universe. Whatever the reason, I was grateful. The idea of bringing a child into that house, of subjecting an innocent life to his cruelty, would have destroyed what little remained of my soul. I thought about leaving 1,000 times, more than 1,000. Every single day for 30 years, some part of me screamed for escape, begged me to run, to grab whatever I could carry and disappear into the night. But leaving wasn't as simple as people who've never been in this situation think it is. Where would I go? I had no money of my own. How would I survive? I had no job, no recent work experience. Who would help me? I'd isolated myself so completely that I had no friends left, and my family, I believed, had given up on me after years of watching me choose him over them. And even if I managed to overcome all those obstacles, there was the fear that kept me frozen more effectively than any chain. What would he do if I tried to leave? He'd told me 100 times what would happen if I ever attempted to run. He'd find me. He always knew where I was, always had ways of tracking me down, and when he found me, the consequences would be worse than anything I'd experienced so far. He promised that if I ever left, I'd regret it for whatever short remainder of my life I had left. I believed him. Fear is a powerful prison, stronger than any bars or locks, and I'd been locked in that prison for so long I couldn't remember what freedom felt like. The morning it all changed started like every other morning. I'd made his breakfast, set out his newspaper, poured his coffee. He came down dressed for work in one of his expensive suits, looking every inch the successful professional man. To anyone on the outside, we probably looked like a normal couple, maybe even a happy one. He'd aged well, still handsome at 62, his hair silver at the temples in a distinguished way. I'd aged terribly, worn down by stress and fear and hopelessness. He ate his breakfast in silence while I stood by the counter, waiting in case he needed anything. This was the routine, had been the routine for decades. He didn't acknowledge me, didn't thank me, didn't even look at me. I was part of the furniture, as much a fixture of the house as the table and chairs. He finished eating, stood, and that's when everything shifted. He looked at me with an expression I recognized immediately, an expression that made my stomach clench with dread. He was in one of his moods, the dangerous kind, the kind that meant he was looking for a reason, any reason to hurt me. He picked up the coffee cup and took a sip, and I watched his face change, watched the anger bloom behind his eyes like a poisonous flower opening its petals. He told me the coffee was cold. It wasn't cold. I'd made it fresh 10 minutes ago, and I'd felt the heat radiating from the pot as I'd poured it. But facts didn't matter when he was like this. Reality didn't matter. All that mattered was that he'd decided the coffee was cold, and that meant I'd failed, and failure meant punishment. He threw the cup, not at me, which would have been almost a mercy because I knew how to take a hit by then, had decades of practice. He threw it at the wall behind me, and it shattered, sending ceramic shards and hot coffee spraying in every direction. Some of the liquid hit my arm, burning, and I flinched but didn't cry out. Crying out only made things worse. He started yelling then, his voice rising to that particular pitch that made my whole body tense with terror. I was useless, incompetent, couldn't do the simplest task right. What did I even do all day if I couldn't make a decent cup of coffee? The words rained down on me like blows, and I stood there and took them, apologizing, promising to make fresh coffee, trying to de-escalate the situation before it went further. But it was too late for de-escalation. He grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into the skin hard enough to bruise, and he pulled me close. His face was inches from mine, and I could smell the coffee on his breath, could see the veins standing out on his neck. He told me I was going to learn, finally going to learn after all these years, and he dragged me toward the kitchen. I knew what was coming. The coffee pot was still hot, still half full of the coffee I'd made, the coffee that was perfectly fine. He was going to burn me with it. He'd done it before, years ago, carefully positioned burns on parts of my body that could be hidden by clothing, teaching me lessons he felt I needed to learn. My mind was screaming, but my body was frozen, locked in the learned helplessness that had kept me trapped for 30 years. Then something snapped. I don't know what it was exactly. Maybe it was the tone of his voice, the absolute certainty that he could do whatever he wanted to me without consequence. Maybe it was the smell of the coffee, bringing back memories of that previous burn and how I'd had to sit in agonizing pain for days while he refused to let me seek medical treatment. Maybe it was just that 30 years was finally, impossibly, enough. Whatever the reason, in that moment, something fundamental shifted inside me. The fear didn't go away, but for the first time in 3 decades, it wasn't the only thing I felt. Underneath the fear, deeper than the terror, was rage. Pure, clean, righteous rage that I'd suppressed for so long I'd almost forgotten it existed. He was reaching for the coffee pot, his hand stretching out toward the glass carafe, and I moved. I don't remember making the decision to move. My body acted on instinct, on the desperate need for survival that even 30 years of abuse hadn't completely extinguished. I twisted in his grip, using his own momentum against him, and shoved him hard. He wasn't expecting resistance. Why would he be? I'd never fought back before, never even tried. His balance shifted, his feet tangled, and he fell backward, hard, his head connecting with the edge of the kitchen counter with a sickening crack that seemed to echo through the house. He hit the floor and lay still. The silence that followed was deafening. I stood frozen, my hand still extended from the shove, my breath coming in ragged gasps, staring at his motionless form on the kitchen floor. Blood was pooling beneath his head, dark and spreading, soaking into the grout between the tiles. For a long moment, my mind couldn't process what had happened. This wasn't possible. This wasn't real. Any second now, he'd get up, and the punishment for fighting back would be worse than anything I'd ever experienced. But he didn't get up. His eyes were closed, his chest rising and falling shallowly, and the blood kept spreading. I'd hurt him. After 30 years of being hurt, I'd hurt him back, and the feeling that washed over me was so complex, I couldn't name it. Terror at what would happen when he woke up. Relief that he was down. Guilt because despite everything, despite 3 decades of abuse, I'd been programmed to feel guilty for causing him any discomfort. And underneath it all, that rage, still burning, still alive. I should have called an ambulance immediately. That's what a normal person would do, what a good person would do. But I wasn't a normal person anymore. I'd been transformed by 30 years of systematic abuse into something else, something capable of standing over my husband's bleeding body and feeling nothing but cold calculation. If I called an ambulance, he'd be treated and released, maybe the same day. He'd come home. And when he came home, what I'd done would be unforgivable. He'd kill me. I knew that with absolute certainty. He wouldn't mean to, perhaps, might not plan it, but in his rage at my betrayal, at my unprecedented act of defiance, he'd go too far. I'd be another statistic, another woman who stayed too long, and everyone would shake their heads and wonder why I didn't leave. So I didn't call an ambulance, not right away. Instead, I did something I'd never done before in my entire marriage. I went into his office, the room I was forbidden to enter, and I started looking through his things. His computer was password protected, but I knew the password. I'd watched him type it enough times, standing in the doorway delivering coffee or a snack. My presence so insignificant, he didn't bother hiding what he was doing. I logged in, my hands shaking, glancing toward the kitchen every few seconds to make sure he was still down. The first thing I found was the money. Bank accounts I didn't know existed, in his name only, containing amounts that made my head spin, hundreds of thousands of dollars. We'd lived frugally my entire marriage, or so I'd thought, me scraping together grocery money and darning his socks because he claimed we needed to save. Meanwhile, he'd been hoarding wealth, building a nest egg that I'd never see, never benefit from, that would be his escape fund when he finally tired of me completely. The second thing I found was the insurance policy. A life insurance policy on me, taken out 15 years ago, for $500,000. I was worth more dead than alive to him, a realization that hit me like a physical blow. The third thing I found was the file folder, tucked in the back of his desk drawer, labeled with my name. Inside were documents, plans, notes. He'd been preparing to have me committed to a psychiatric facility. There were letters from a doctor I'd never met, diagnosing me with severe mental illness, recommending institutionalization. There were forms, already filled out, needing only his signature and a judge's approval to have me locked away. There were financial projections showing how much he'd save by having me declared incompetent, how he'd gain control of any remaining assets in my name, how he'd be free to live his life while I rotted in some facility. This had been his plan. Not to kill me, though the insurance policy suggested that was a backup option, but to have me erased, declared insane, removed from society so completely and legally that no one would question my disappearance. And looking at the dates on the documents, he'd been planning to execute this plan within the next month. I sat at his desk holding these papers, and something inside me calcified into diamond-hard determination. I wasn't going to let him do this. I wasn't going to be erased. I wasn't going to disappear. For 30 years, I'd been the perfect victim, and it had gotten me nothing but pain and a plan to have me institutionalized. It was time to be something else. I called my cousin, Letitia, someone I hadn't spoken to in 15 years. I didn't know if she'd even answer, didn't know if she'd help, but she was my only hope. The phone rang 4 times, and I was preparing to hang up when her voice came through, cautious and surprised. I told her I needed help, that I needed her to come to the house immediately, that I couldn't explain over the phone, but I was begging her to trust me. There was a long silence, and I thought she'd refuse, thought 15 years of silence had been too long. But then she said she'd be there in 20 minutes, and I nearly collapsed with relief. While I waited for Letitia, I called the ambulance. I told them my husband had fallen and hit his head, that he was unconscious and bleeding, that I needed help. My voice was shaking, tears were streaming down my face, and it wasn't an act. The operator kept me on the line, asking questions, telling me to check his breathing and pulse, walking me through basic first aid. I knelt beside him on the blood-soaked floor and pressed a kitchen towel to his head wound, applying pressure like the operator instructed. And some distant part of me marveled at the fact that I was trying to save him, trying to keep alive the man who'd destroyed my life. But I needed him alive. A dead husband was a quick investigation that might go nowhere. A living husband who could tell his side of the story, that was something I could work with, something I could plan around. The ambulance arrived 7 minutes before Letitia did, and the paramedics flooded into my kitchen with equipment and efficiency, taking over his care, asking me questions I answered in a dazed monotone. What happened? He fell. How did he fall? He was reaching for something and lost his balance. Was he dizzy before? I don't know. I wasn't paying attention. The lies came easily. 3 decades of practice making me an expert deceiver. They loaded him onto a stretcher, told me they were taking him to the county hospital, asked if I wanted to ride in the ambulance with him. I said I'd drive myself, that I needed to lock up the house and gather his insurance information. They nodded and left, sirens wailing, and I stood in my bloody kitchen and waited for my cousin. Letitia arrived in a cloud of expensive perfume and barely contained questions. She was 48, 4 years younger than me, and she'd aged beautifully. Her skin smooth and glowing, her hair styled professionally, her clothes expensive and well-fitted. She looked at me, really looked at me, and I saw her face crumble as she took in what 30 years had done to me. She didn't ask what happened. She just pulled me into a hug, the first real human affection I'd experienced in longer than I could remember, and I broke down completely. I sobbed in her arms while she stroked my hair and made soothing sounds, and for the first time in decades, I felt like maybe I wasn't completely alone. When I could finally speak, I told her everything, not just what had happened that morning, but everything. 30 years of abuse, control, isolation, fear, the fake psychiatric diagnosis, the insurance policy, the bank accounts, the plans to have me committed. I showed her the documents, spread them across the kitchen table while we sat in chairs, pulled far from the blood still drying on the floor. Letitia listened to everything, her face cycling through shock, horror, rage, and finally, grim determination. When I finished, she looked at me for a long moment, and then she asked me a question that changed my life. She asked me if I wanted to survive this, or if I wanted to win. I didn't understand the distinction at first. Weren't they the same thing? But Letitia explained. Surviving meant taking the evidence I'd found, going to the police, hoping they'd believe me, hoping a prosecutor would take the case, hoping for protection and justice through a system that failed women like me every day. Surviving was uncertain, passive, dependent on other people's decisions. Winning was different. Winning was active, strategic, taking control of my own fate instead of putting it in someone else's hands. Winning meant using every piece of evidence, every document, every account number, building a case so airtight that he couldn't wriggle free. Winning meant burning his life down the way he'd burned mine, completely and without mercy. I chose to win. Letitia made a phone call to her sister, Monique, who happened to be a criminal defense attorney, one of the best in the state. Within an hour, Monique was sitting at my kitchen table, looking at the same documents, asking sharp, precise questions, and formulating a plan. She told me we needed to move fast, that I needed to secure everything before he woke up and realized what was happening. She made a list of what we needed: documents, accounts, passwords, evidence of abuse, medical records if I had them, testimony from anyone who'd witnessed anything. Letitia and Monique worked with military precision, dividing tasks, making calls, organizing what I'd found and searching for more. We photographed everything in his office, downloaded files from his computer, made copies of copies. Monique called a private investigator she trusted, and he arrived 2 hours later, a quiet man who looked at me with professional sympathy and promised he'd find anything there was to find. They told me to document my injuries. I hadn't thought about it, hadn't realized that the burns from the coffee, the bruise forming on my arm from where he'd grabbed me, the old scars and marks covering my body, all of that was evidence. Monique took photographs with a professional camera while I stood in the bathroom in my underwear, feeling exposed and ashamed, but understanding it was necessary. Each photo was time-stamped, documented, added to the growing file that Monique was building. The hospital called that evening. He was awake, stable, asking for me. The doctor said he had a concussion and needed to stay overnight for observation, but he was going to be fine. I thanked them and said I'd be there in the morning, and when I hung up, I felt that rage surge again. He was going to be fine. After everything he'd done to me, after 30 years of torture, he was going to be fine. It seemed impossibly unfair until Monique reminded me that him being alive and healthy was actually better for our case. We needed him functional enough to face consequences. That night, for the first time in my marriage, I slept soundly. Letitia stayed with me, and Monique camped out in the living room with her laptop and files, working through the night to prepare. I lay in the bed I'd shared with my abuser for 3 decades, and I slept without fear for the first time since my wedding night. The next morning, I didn't go to the hospital. Instead, I went with Monique to her office downtown, a sleek space in a glass tower that spoke of success and power. She'd assembled a team overnight, paralegals and junior attorneys who were reviewing documents, building timelines, contacting experts. They all looked at me with a mixture of sympathy and determination, like I was a cause they were taking on, a battle they intended to win. Monique sat me down and explained the strategy. We were going to hit him from every angle. Criminal charges for domestic violence, supported by the photographs and my testimony. A restraining order to keep him away from me. A divorce filing that would freeze all assets and start the process of dividing them, but more importantly, would give us legal standing to subpoena his financial records and dig even deeper. A report to the medical board about the doctor who'd written the fake psychiatric evaluation. A report to the insurance company about the policy he'd taken out on me. We were going to dismantle his life piece by piece. The hospital released him the next afternoon, and the police were waiting. Monique had filed charges that morning, and they arrested him as he walked out of the hospital, still in the clothes he'd worn when the ambulance brought him in, still with a bandage wrapped around his head. I wasn't there to see it, but the private investigator was, documenting everything with photos and video. The look on his face when they handcuffed him, the confusion and rage and disbelief, was captured in high definition. He tried to call me from jail. I didn't answer. He tried to call 12 times over the next 2 days, and I blocked his number. His family started calling, his mother and sisters, demanding to know what was happening, insisting this was a misunderstanding, accusing me of overreacting. I blocked them too. The only people I talked to were Monique, Letitia, and slowly, carefully, my own family. Calling my mother was one of the hardest things I've ever done. I hadn't really talked to her in years, our conversations reduced to stilted phone calls on holidays where I lied about how happy I was. When I told her the truth, when I finally admitted what had been happening, she cried. She blamed herself for not pushing harder, not forcing me to accept help, not rescuing me when I clearly needed rescuing. I told her it wasn't her fault, that I'd made my own choices, but deep down, I understood her guilt because I felt it too. Guilt over wasted years, over lies told, over opportunities for escape that I'd let slip through my fingers out of fear. My siblings rallied around me with a fierceness that took my breath away. Brothers I hadn't seen in a decade suddenly became my protective wall, promising that he'd never get near me again. My sister, who'd stopped inviting me to family events because I always made excuses, invited me to stay with her for as long as I needed. The family I thought I'd lost through my own isolation hadn't abandoned me at all. They'd been waiting, hoping, ready to step in the moment I gave them the chance. The legal process moved faster than I expected. Monique was relentless, filing motions, demanding hearings, keeping pressure constant. The restraining order was granted immediately based on the photographs and my testimony. He wasn't allowed within 500 feet of me, couldn't call or contact me in any way, and if he violated the order, he'd go straight back to jail. The knowledge that he couldn't get to me, that there was finally a barrier between us, was intoxicating. The criminal case was more complex. He hired the expensive lawyer, the one who'd been sitting beside him in court that first day, and they fought every charge. His lawyer claimed I was a scorned wife making false allegations, that his injuries proved I was actually the aggressor, that the documents I'd found were taken illegally and should be inadmissible. Monique destroyed every argument systematically, presenting evidence, calling experts, building a case that was overwhelming in its thoroughness. But it was the divorce proceedings where things got truly interesting. Monique subpoenaed all his financial records, and the private investigator earned every penny of his fee. They found accounts I'd never seen, investments made with money that should have been ours jointly, transfers to offshore accounts that suggested tax evasion. They found payments to the doctor who'd written the fake psychiatric report, proving the diagnosis was bought and paid for. They found emails discussing his plans for me, laying out his strategy for having me committed in his own words. The portrait that emerged was of a man who'd been systematically robbing and abusing me for 3 decades, who'd viewed me not as a partner, but as a resource to be exploited and eventually discarded. When Monique presented all of this to his lawyer, suggesting they settle the divorce quietly before the criminal trial brought everything into public light, his lawyer came back with a laughable offer. He'd agree to the divorce if I'd drop the criminal charges, and he'd give me $50,000 as a settlement. $50,000 after 30 years of marriage, after all the abuse, after stealing hundreds of thousands from joint accounts. Monique laughed in his face and told him we'd see him in court. The trial, when it finally came, was everything I'd hoped for, and everything I'd feared. I had to testify, had to sit on the witness stand, and recount the worst moments of my life in front of a room full of strangers, while he sat at the defense table and stared at me with cold hatred. His lawyer tried to tear me apart, suggested I was lying, exaggerating, seeking revenge for an unhappy marriage. Monique had prepared me for this, had practiced the cross-examination with me a dozen times, but practice couldn't completely prepare me for the reality of having my pain questioned and dismissed. I broke down on the stand twice, once when describing the first time he hit me on our wedding night, and once when explaining the years of isolation, the way he'd systematically cut me off from everyone who might have helped. The judge called a recess both times, giving me time to compose myself, and both times I came back stronger, more determined to tell the truth no matter how much it hurt. The prosecution called expert witnesses who explained the cycle of domestic violence, why victims stay, how abusers maintain control. They called the investigators who'd found the hidden money and the fake psychiatric reports. They called my cousin Letitia, who testified about the state she'd found me in, about the fear in my eyes and the blood on the kitchen floor. They built a case that was comprehensive and devastating. His defense was weak, barely coherent. His lawyer tried to paint him as a successful man, whose wife had become resentful and vindictive, but the evidence against him was too strong. The photographs of my injuries, the documents in his own handwriting, the testimony of experts and family members, it all piled up until his protestations of innocence sounded hollow even to the jury. The deliberations took 3 days, 3 days during which I barely ate or slept, terrified that somehow he'd escape justice, that the jury would believe his lies over my truth. Monique kept reassuring me that the case was solid, that we'd done everything possible, but I couldn't shake the fear until the moment the verdict was read. Guilty, guilty on all counts. Domestic violence, assault, false imprisonment through psychological coercion, fraud for the financial crimes they'd uncovered. The jury had seen through his facade, had understood what he'd done to me, and they'd held him accountable. I watched him crumble in his chair as the verdicts were read, watched his expensive lawyer pat his shoulder uselessly, and I felt that rage finally begin to cool into something like peace. That brought us to the sentencing hearing, to the moment I'd been waiting for, the moment when I could finally speak directly to him with the protection of the law and the truth on my side. The judge asked if I had anything to say before she delivered the final rulings. I stood slowly, feeling the weight of 30 years lifting from my shoulders with each inch I rose. I looked at him, really looked at him for the first time in years without fear clouding my vision. He was an old man now, diminished by the trial and the evidence of his crimes, no longer the terrifying figure who'd controlled my life for so long. I told the court, told everyone listening about the 30 years he'd stolen from me. The dreams I'd abandoned, the person I'd been before he systematically destroyed her. I told them about living in constant fear, about the isolation, about the physical and psychological torture that had been my daily reality. I told them about the morning he'd tried to burn me, and I'd finally fought back, and how that one moment of desperate self-defense had saved my life. I told them about the plans I'd found, about how close I'd come to disappearing into a psychiatric facility, declared insane by a man who'd spent 3 decades driving me toward the brink of madness. I told them that I was standing here today not because the system had protected me, because it hadn't, but because I'd finally found the strength to protect myself. And I told them that I wanted the maximum sentence, that I wanted him to spend what remained of his life understanding what it felt like to be powerless, controlled, afraid. The judge listened to everything, her face impassive, and when I finished, she nodded once and thanked me for my courage. Then she turned to him and delivered a sentence that took my breath away. 25 years for the domestic violence charges, running consecutively with additional years for the fraud and attempted psychological abuse. At 62 years old, he'd be 87 before he was eligible for parole, assuming he lived that long. It was more than I'd hoped for, more than Monique had predicted, and it was justice. The divorce settlement came through a week later. The judge awarded me everything, every account he'd hidden, every investment, the house we'd lived in that I immediately sold because I never wanted to step foot in it again, and half of his pension that he'd never see. The total came to just over $1 million, money that represented 30 years of my stolen labor, stolen time, stolen life. It wasn't enough, could never be enough, but it was something. More importantly, it was mine, free and clear, and it represented not just compensation, but freedom. I bought a small house in a quiet neighborhood, nothing fancy but mine, truly mine, with my name on the deed and no memories of fear soaking into the walls. I started therapy, working through 3 decades of trauma with a patient counselor who helped me understand that what happened to me wasn't my fault, that staying didn't make me weak, that surviving made me strong. I reconnected with my family, rebuilding relationships that had been damaged but not destroyed, learning to trust again that people could love me without wanting to control me. I even started dating, tentatively, cautiously, a kind man I met at a community center who knew my story and never once tried to rush me or push me beyond my comfort zone. I don't know if it'll lead anywhere, and that's okay. For the first time in my adult life, I'm discovering who I am outside of someone else's expectations, outside of fear and survival mode. I'm learning what I like, what I want, what I dream about for my future. I'm 52 years old, and in many ways, my life is just beginning. The scars remain, physical and psychological, reminders of what I endured and what I survived. Some days are harder than others, days when a loud noise or a certain tone of voice sends me spiraling back to those years of terror. But those days are becoming less frequent, and I'm learning to be patient with myself, to understand that healing isn't linear, that setbacks don't erase progress. I think about the woman I was on that morning when everything changed, standing in my kitchen, making coffee for a man who was planning to erase me from existence. I think about how close I came to disappearing, to becoming another statistic, another woman who stayed too long. And I think about the strength it took to fight back in that moment, to trust my cousin after 15 years of silence, to work with Monique and build a case and stand up in court and demand justice. That strength was always there, buried under years of abuse, but never completely extinguished. I just needed one moment, one split-second decision to push, instead of submit, to change the trajectory of my life. People ask me sometimes why I'm sharing this story, why I'm willing to have my pain examined and discussed. The answer is simple. Because somewhere out there, another woman is standing in her kitchen, making coffee for someone who's destroying her, believing she has no options, no hope, no way out. I want her to know that she does. I want her to know that it's never too late to fight back, to seek help, to demand better. I want her to know that she's stronger than she thinks, that survival is possible, that justice is possible, that life after abuse is possible. I want her to know that she deserves better, that she's worth saving, that she can win. My name is Shanice. I'm 52 years old, and I spent 30 years of my life in hell. But I made it out. I fought back. I won. And if I can do it, if I can go from that terrified woman in the blood-stained kitchen to the woman I am today, standing in my own home, free and safe, and building a future on my own terms, then anyone can. It's not easy. The path from victim to survivor is long and painful and full of setbacks. But it's possible, and it's worth it. Every single day of freedom is worth it. Every morning I wake up without fear is worth it. Every relationship I'm rebuilding, every dream I'm pursuing, every moment of peace and joy and simple contentment is worth it. The night after the sentencing, I stood on the back porch of my temporary apartment and looked up at the stars. It was a clear night, the sky vast and full of possibilities, and I felt something I hadn't felt in so long I'd almost forgotten what it was like. Hope. Real, genuine hope for the future, not the desperate, grasping hope of someone drowning, but the calm, confident hope of someone who knows they're going to be okay. I thought about the journey that had brought me to that moment, the pain and fear and desperate struggle. I thought about the people who'd helped me, Letitia and Monique and the private investigator and the prosecutors and the jury members who'd believed me. I thought about the family who'd never stopped loving me even when I'd pushed them away. I thought about the woman I'd been at 20, full of dreams and ambitions, and the woman I was now at 52, scarred but surviving, and I realized something profound. That young woman wasn't dead. She'd been sleeping, buried, trapped, but not dead. And now she was waking up, emerging from the ashes of 3 decades of abuse, and she still had dreams. They were different dreams now, tempered by experience and trauma, but they were real and they were mine and no one could take them from me. I'm going back to school. It's ridiculous, maybe, a 52-year-old woman enrolling in college classes, but I don't care. I'm finishing the degree I started 33 years ago, the one I abandoned when I met him. I'm studying law, inspired by Monique and the justice system that finally, after so many years of failing me, came through in the end. I want to help other women, want to be for them what Monique was for me, a fierce advocate who believes them and fights for them and refuses to let them be erased. I volunteer at a domestic violence shelter, sharing my story with women who are where I was, offering hope and practical advice and proof that escape is possible. Some of them look at me with skepticism, unable to believe that someone could endure what I endured and come out the other side. Others look at me with desperate hope, clinging to my words like a lifeline. I tell them all the same thing. You are not alone. You are not crazy. It's not your fault. And you can survive this. The criminal justice system isn't perfect. I know that. I got lucky in many ways. Lucky that I found those documents before he woke up. Lucky that my cousin answered the phone. Lucky that Monique took my case. Lucky that the jury believed me. Not every woman who fights back gets justice. Not every abuser faces consequences. The system fails women constantly, dismissing their claims, questioning their credibility, allowing dangerous men to walk free. But that doesn't mean we stop fighting. It means we fight harder, demand better, support each other, and refuse to accept a world where abuse is tolerated and victims are blamed. I've become an advocate, speaking at events, meeting with legislators, pushing for better laws and better protection for domestic violence survivors. It's not work I ever imagined doing, but it feels right, feels like I'm taking my pain and transforming it into something meaningful. Every time I share my story, every time I see recognition in another woman's eyes, every time someone reaches out for help because they heard me speak, it feels like I'm taking back power from him, using what he did to me to help others escape their own abusers. He writes me letters from prison. I don't read them. They go straight into a folder in Monique's office, unread, because even now he's trying to maintain control, trying to worm his way back into my consciousness. The letters are probably full of apologies and explanations and justifications, or maybe they're full of threats and blame. I don't care which. His words have no power over me anymore. He's a ghost from my past, locked away where he can't hurt anyone, and I'm living in the present, building a future he has no part in. Sometimes I see men who remind me of him, the same build or walk or tone of voice, and my heart rate spikes, my palms sweat, and I have to practice the breathing exercises my therapist taught me. Those moments are getting less frequent, less intense, but they probably won't ever completely go away. Trauma changes your brain, rewires your responses, and 30 years of trauma isn't erased by one verdict and one sentencing. But I'm learning to live with it, learning that I can carry these scars and still have a full, meaningful life. The money from the settlement is in a trust, carefully invested, providing me with financial security for the first time in my adult life. I don't live extravagantly. 3 decades of forced frugality taught me to be careful with money, and besides, happiness isn't in expensive things. It's in the small freedoms I never had before. The ability to buy a book without asking permission, to go to a movie on a whim, to donate to causes I care about, to help a friend in need. It's in the knowledge that I'm not dependent on anyone, that I can take care of myself, that I'll never again be trapped because I have nowhere else to go. I celebrated my 53rd birthday last month, a small party with family and a few close friends I've made in this new chapter of my life. It was simple, cake and ice cream and laughter, but it was the first birthday in 30 years that wasn't marked by fear and walking on eggshells and trying to anticipate what mood he'd be in. My nieces and nephews were there, young people I barely knew because I'd been absent from their lives for so long, and they treated me with a mixture of curiosity and respect. One of my nieces, a bright 20-year-old studying social work, pulled me aside and told me I was her hero. The words made me cry, happy tears this time, because I never thought of myself as anyone's hero. I'm just a survivor, just someone who finally fought back when fighting back was the only option left. But if my story can inspire someone else, can show them that they're stronger than they know, then maybe that's enough. Looking back on that morning when everything changed, I don't regret pushing him. I know I probably should feel guilty about the violence, about fighting back instead of finding some peaceful solution. But I can't make myself feel guilty for the act that saved my life. He was going to burn me, was going to continue the torture that had defined 3 decades of my life, and I stopped him. That's all. I stopped him from hurting me, and the consequences that followed, his arrest, his conviction, his imprisonment. Those weren't my doing. Those were his, the natural result of his own choices, his own actions, his own cruelty finally catching up with him. The justice system worked in my case, but I know I'm one of the lucky ones. I had evidence, documents in his own hand, photographs, financial records, expert testimony. I had a skilled attorney who believed me and fought for me. I had family who supported me and resources to fight back. Many women have none of those things. They fight back and get arrested themselves. They try to leave and have nowhere to go. They seek help and are turned away. They go to court and are not believed. The system is broken in so many ways, and until we fix it, women will keep dying at the hands of their abusers, will keep being trapped in situations they can't escape. That's why I do this work now, why I speak out, why I push for change. Because Shanice at 20 deserved better than what happened to her. Because Shanice at 52 almost didn't make it out. And because there are countless other women whose names I'll never know who deserve the chance to escape, to survive, to build new lives free from fear. My story has an ending that many don't get. I'm alive, I'm free, I'm healing. That's not the reality for too many women, and that truth haunts me even as I celebrate my own survival. I think about the woman I was, standing in that kitchen, making coffee, trapped in a nightmare with no end in sight. I think about how close I came to never escaping, to being institutionalized or killed, or just slowly ground down until nothing remained. And I think about how one moment, one desperate act of self-defense, changed everything. That's what I want people to understand. Change is possible. It might come in a dramatic moment like it did for me, or it might come gradually, one small choice at a time. But it's possible. You can survive. You can escape. You can reclaim your life. It won't be easy, and the scars will remain. But on the other side of that fear and pain is a life worth living. I'm living proof of that. Every day I wake up in my own house, make my own decisions, pursue my own dreams, and live without fear is proof that surviving is possible, that justice is possible, that healing is possible. I still have bad days. Yesterday was one of them, triggered by nothing I could identify, just a wave of anxiety and memory that left me shaking and crying in my therapist's office. But I also have good days, great days, days when I laugh until my stomach hurts and feel joy so pure it's almost painful. The bad days are part of the journey, not a sign that I'm failing or that the healing isn't working. They're reminders of where I've been, and they make the good days even sweeter by contrast. I'm dating that kind man I mentioned, taking things slowly, learning what healthy love looks like. He knows my history, knows why I flinch sometimes at sudden movements, why I need lots of reassurance, why trust doesn't come easily. And he's patient, respectful, willing to move at my pace and understand that my normal is different from most people's. I don't know if it'll last forever, and I'm okay with that uncertainty. For 30 years, I was trapped in something that was supposed to be forever, and that forever nearly killed me. Now I'm learning to live in the present, to appreciate what I have without needing guarantees about the future. My mother tells me I look younger now than I did 3 years ago, and I think she might be right. The weight of constant fear and stress aged me prematurely, carved lines in my face and dimmed the light in my eyes. Now, free from that burden, I'm slowly transforming back into someone I barely recognize. Someone who smiles easily and laughs often and looks at the world with hope instead of dread. It's like watching myself be reborn, and it's the most beautiful thing I've ever experienced. The house I bought is small but perfect, painted in colors I chose, decorated with furniture I selected, filled with things that make me happy instead of things designed to please someone else. I have a garden in the backyard where I grow vegetables and flowers, getting my hands dirty in the soil and watching things grow, nurturing life instead of just surviving. I have neighbors who know me as Shanice, not as Darnell's wife, who invite me to block parties and holiday gatherings and treat me like a person in my own right. I have a life that's mine, fully and completely mine, and that's a gift I'll never take for granted. I want to end by saying this to anyone who's reading this story and seeing themselves in my experience. You are not alone. What you're going through is not normal, not acceptable, not your fault. You deserve better. You deserve safety, respect, love without fear, a life where you can be yourself without punishment. And you can have those things. It might seem impossible right now, the idea of escape, but it's not. I thought it was impossible for 30 years, and I was wrong. There are resources available, people who want to help, organizations dedicated to supporting domestic violence survivors. The National Domestic Violence Hotline is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Shelters exist in every state. Legal aid organizations can help even if you have no money. Therapists, counselors, and support groups can provide emotional support and practical advice. You don't have to do this alone. I know it's scary. I know leaving or fighting back feels impossible. I know you've probably been told 1,000 times that you're worthless, that no one else would want you, that you deserve the treatment you're receiving, that you're crazy or oversensitive or the problem. Those are all lies. Lies designed to keep you trapped, to maintain control over you, to break you down so completely that you stop believing escape is possible. But you can escape. You can survive. You can heal. I did it, and I'm not special or extraordinarily strong. I'm just a woman who finally reached her breaking point and decided that anything, even the unknown terror of fighting back, was better than one more day of abuse. If you're in immediate danger, call 911. If you're planning to leave, be careful, do it safely, have a plan and a place to go. If you're not ready to leave yet, start documenting everything. Take photos of injuries, keep records of incidents, save threatening messages, start building your case for the day when you are ready. And know that whether you stay or leave, whether you fight back or endure, whether you survive or don't make it out, none of it is your fault. The only person responsible for abuse is the abuser. You deserve better. You deserve safety. You deserve love without violence. You deserve a life free from fear. And you can have it. It's possible. I'm living proof. Did you like the story? And which city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. If you like the story, you can support me by sending a super thanks so I can keep bringing more stories like this. Thank you so much for your sweet support. I'm looking forward to your comments on the story. On the screen, you can see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend. There's so much more on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story. With love and respect.